On the night of March 27, 1941, a coup in Belgrade overturned the pro-Axis government of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Within days, Adolf Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 25, a decision to eliminate the new government, secure Germany's southern flank, and open the way for operations in Greece. What followed was a swift, coordinated assault that began on April 6th and ended less than 2 weeks later with the unconditional surrender of Yugoslavia. This is the story of that campaign. How it began, how it unfolded, why it collapsed so quickly, and what its consequences were for the Balkans and the wider war. To understand the invasion, we must start with the strategic context. In late 1940 and early 1941, the Balkans were a tangle of competing ambitions. Italy had invaded Greece in October 1940 and met unexpected resistance, requiring German assistance. Romania's oil fields were vital to the German war effort, and any Allied foothold in the Balkans threatened them. Hitler saw the region as critical to securing his eastern flank before the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. The coup in Belgrade, which brought to power officers who were more sympathetic to the Allies, convinced Hitler that a rapid, decisive intervention was necessary. The German plan combined overwhelming air power with rapid armored thrusts. Long before ground forces crossed any borders, the Luftwaffe struck. On April 6, the Luftwaffe launched a massive bombing campaign against Belgrade, aiming to paralyze command and communication and to break the will of the defenders. The attacks stunned the city, damaged infrastructure, and signaled that the campaign would be ruthless and fast. Simultaneously, German troops began moving into Yugoslavia from multiple directions, from the east, across the Bulgarian border into southern Serbia, from the north, across the Romanian and Hungarian frontiers, and from the northwest, across the Ostmark, today's Austria. The axis of advance was designed to encircle and overwhelm Yugoslav forces before they could form a coherent defense. Yugoslavia's military was large on paper but fragile in practice. The army suffered from poor training, outdated equipment, and a command structure that was both politically and ethnically fractured. Milosevic's new government tried to hold the country together by bringing Croat leaders into the cabinet, but national divisions ran deep. In many areas, loyalty to the central government was weak. Ethnic tensions between Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others were an operational liability. Scholars have debated the impact of so-called fifth column activities, groups within Yugoslavia who might have collaborated with the invaders. And while there were instances of local collaboration, most historians now argue that fifth columnism was only one factor among many. Low morale, poor logistics, and the speed and coordination of the German assault played larger roles in the collapse. On the ground, the Germans used classic blitzkrieg tactics, concentrated armored spearheads supported by motorized infantry and close air support. The 2nd Panzer Group pushed from the north and east, while other corps advanced from the northeast and the east to seize key crossroads and river crossings. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority, not only bombing cities, but also disrupting troop movements and supply lines. In the south, German forces entered from Bulgaria, striking toward Niš and Belgrade, while other columns pushed into the north and west. The Yugoslav High Command struggled to respond. Communications broke down, orders were delayed or misunderstood, and units often acted in isolation. Italy's role was more cautious at first. Mussolini's forces were already engaged in Greece and initially limited themselves to air raids and artillery attacks against Yugoslav positions. On April 11th, however, the Italian army began a more direct offensive toward Ljubljana and down the Dalmatian coast, and Italian troops moved from Albania into southern Yugoslavia. Their progress met little real resistance in many areas, in part because Yugoslav defenses were already strained by German advances elsewhere. Hungary and Romania also entered the campaign, seizing border regions and supporting the German drive. Hungarian units moved into Bačka and Baranja. Romanian troops pushed toward the Banat and other border areas. Bulgaria allowed German forces to operate across its territory, enabling a thrust into southern Serbia. Belgrade's destruction and the speed of the German advances shattered the central government's ability to coordinate a defense. Within days, some Yugoslav units refused to fight, others were cut off, and leaders debated surrender. Croatia's declaration of independence on April 10th, supported by Germany, further fragmented resistance. The proclamation of the independent state of Croatia removed Croat political leaders from a national government and signaled to many Croatian soldiers and civilians that the old kingdom was disintegrating. By mid-April, German formations had reached or were threatening most major cities and transport hubs. Encirclement and the collapse of organized resistance became inevitable. Several explanations account for how a nation with hundreds of thousands of troops could fall so quickly. First, the Yugoslav armed forces were not uniformly modernized. They lacked anti-tank weaponry, had limited mechanization, and suffered from shortages of fuel and spare parts. Second, the political upheaval caused by the coup created confusion at the highest levels of command. Third, the German army demonstrated superior coordination between air and ground forces, concentrating combat power at decisive points and exploiting Yugoslavia's fragmented defenses. Fourth, the psychological impact of the bombing of Belgrade and the rapid collapse in the north induced surrender in many quarters. Fifth, internal ethnic divisions undermined the will to resist in some regions. Together, these factors produced a rapid military breakdown that became a decisive Axis victory. By April 17th, an armistice was signed. It took effect at noon on April 18th. The Yugoslav army surrendered unconditionally. The victory was complete and costly in other ways. Yugoslavia was partitioned and occupied. Germany established zones of direct control in Serbia and the Banat, while other regions were annexed or handed over to Axis allies. Hungary occupied parts of the north. Italy took much of the Adriatic coastline and later extended control into parts of Dalmatia. Bulgaria gained territory in the southeast, and Albania, under Italian influence, absorbed areas in Kosovo and Western Macedonia. Most consequentially for the political map of the region, Germany established the independent state of Croatia, a puppet regime that encompassed vast territories including Srem, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and large parts of what had been Croatian lands. The occupation and partition had immediate and brutal consequences. Repressive measures were imposed, political opponents and minorities were targeted, and the new puppet administrations collaborated with Axis authorities in persecution. In some areas, particularly in Serbia and parts of Bosnia, German occupation policies were harsh. Reprisals, executions, and the suppression of civil liberties followed. The establishment of the NDH unleashed its own internal campaign of violence. The Ustase regime engaged in brutal reprisals and ethnic cleansing against Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents, sowing the seeds for the bitter and violent struggle that would define much of Yugoslavia's wartime experience. Yet the story did not end with the armistice. Occupation sparked resistance across the region. Partisan movements coalesced rapidly, the best known being the communist-led partisans under Josip Broz Tito, who would come to dominate the anti-Axis struggle in Yugoslavia. Alongside them, royalist Chetnik groups initially resisted the occupiers but later, in some cases, became entangled in local collaboration and internecine conflict. The result was a chaotic, multi-sided civil war within the occupation, a brutal contest among resistance, collaborators, and occupiers that cost countless civilian lives and left deep scars on the region. From a broader military perspective, the Balkan campaign achieved what Hitler intended. It secured the southern flank and allowed Germany to focus on Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941. It also relieved the pressure on Italy and Greece, enabling a combined Axis effort that soon overran Greece as well. But the campaign also produced long-term complications. The occupation fueled resistance that tied down Axis forces for years, and the violence of occupation policies deepened ethnic grievances that would resurface long after the war. The map of Europe was redrawn, populations were displaced, and the political landscape of the Balkans was transformed. When historians look back at the April War, they highlight a number of enduring lessons. Speed and coordination in modern mechanized warfare can shatter larger but less cohesive forces. Political instability undermines military effectiveness. Air power, when used decisively and at the outset of a campaign, can cripple command and control and sap civilian morale. Finally, occupation strategies that rely on brutal repression often backfire, producing protracted insurgencies that consume resources and leave lasting social trauma. The human dimension of the invasion is often lost in maps and troop dispositions. Across Yugoslavia, ordinary people, soldiers, workers, farmers, and families in towns and villages, woke to invasion, fled their homes, or found their towns transformed by marching armies and air raids. The rapidity of the campaign left little time for orderly retreat or evacuation. The subsequent occupation brought hardship, food shortages, forced labor, and terror for many. At the same time, the hardships of occupation prompted acts of courage and sacrifice by those who joined the resistance, by partisans who sheltered civilians, and by individuals who resisted collaboration. These human stories would shape post-war memory and politics in Yugoslavia and beyond. In the naval and air dimensions, the campaign demonstrated the Luftwaffe's ability to shape outcomes on land by achieving air superiority early and sustaining pressure against logistics and communications. The German air operations over Belgrade and other strategic centers were designed not just to destroy infrastructure, but to intimidate and demoralize. Meanwhile, the Axis ground forces, exploiting mechanization and concentrated armor, severed lines of communication and encircled large formations, making coordinated defense nearly impossible. Where the Yugoslavs fought effectively, in some isolated engagements and in mountainous terrain, they showed resilience, but such standpoints could not change the wider strategic calculus. By the time the armistice came into effect, Yugoslavia as a unified state had effectively ceased to exist. What remained was an occupied territory, partitioned among powers with competing aims. The suppression of the Yugoslav state did not, however, suppress the idea of Yugoslavia among many of its peoples. The resistance movements, especially Tito's partisans, would rebuild a new political order after the war, one that emerged victorious and founded the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The wartime experience, invasion, occupation, collaboration, resistance, and civil conflict became a crucible that forged new elites and new narratives about nationhood, legitimacy, and justice. Looking back, the April 1941 invasion stands as a stark example of how rapidly war can reorder nations. In less than 2 weeks, a kingdom was defeated, a region partitioned, and the lives of millions thrown into turmoil. The campaign was short in duration but consequential in impact. It shaped the course of the Balkans during World War II and cast a long shadow over the region's post-war politics. That is the legacy of the invasion of Yugoslavia, a dramatic episode of speed and violence that reshaped borders, governments, and the lives of ordinary people, and whose reverberations would be felt for decades to come. Like and subscribe to History Safe for more original color film from the past.